Thank you for tuning in and welcome back to the Sandwich of Coherency. So let's just go ahead and jump right into this. As we've been talking about lately, we've been talking a lot about the Green New Deal and the expansion, or rather the de-expansion of the United States at the cost of the expansion of other nations. The destruction of the United States at the cost of giving the growth of the United States to other countries. And it just seems like there's this huge, massive global agenda that's staked on the destruction of the United States. Now, I know that can sound very pro-America, which it is. Okay, let's not get that twisted. And it can sound like it's anti-other nations, but it's really not. You see, for some reason, despite all the things that keep happening and what's going on, more and more businesses are just being pushed out of the United States. There's this major push for the United States to become reliant on other nations around the world for basic things that the United States should be able to handle. Now, there was a report by Chuck Grassley years ago, and it stated the fact that 80% of raw materials for medicines were produced in China for the United States. That ended up getting twisted to be 80% of America's medicine is made in China, which that's not the case, but the raw materials for it, to be able to make the medicines are mostly produced there. And that seems to be a big, major issue because one has to ask himself, why does the United States not produce its own? And what this stems down to is, well, China came along and said, hey, we'll make it for cheaper, so you don't even have to make it yourself. Now, that's not cost effective, but when you do that for many, 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 many nations at once, it then begins to turn a profit. You see, people think that China and the importation of their products into the United States that America does is only just for America. You know, a lot of people don't understand that China produces on a global scale. You know, they're producing over 50, 60% of the world's goods. This is a problem. Not just for each of those nations, but in itself, even for China. Because they cannot sustain that. There's no way that they possess enough resources to sustain that. Now, back in, I want to say about 2020, you know, there were reports that China was running out of the resources and they could possibly be out of the game of major production because of lack of resources in 10 years by 2030. And that seems a little like a stretch, but I'd like to say that actually seems to be more of a reality as we have moved on in these years, past couple years. You know, people are not paying attention to the massive amounts of floods that have been hitting China. China has been getting hit with floods and major damage for the past couple years. There are millions of people that have been displaced because of this. You really only hear about the corona modelos. I have to be careful with those words, don't I? You know, you really only hear about that and displacement of people do that really. Lockdowns in Shanghai and whatnot. But there's not a lot of talk about the millions upon millions of people that have actually been displaced by flooding. Just heavy rain, especially last year, just heavy. Land is being destroyed and a lot now it's underwater. And I wonder, okay, this is going to sound kind of like a little crazy conspiracy, but considering the fact that China said that they figured they were able to manipulate weather so they could get those clear skies for the Olympics. This is just off the wall talking here. Could maybe all the rain and flooding they suffered be a result of their attempt at weather manipulation? And I say that because there was a report by Bloomberg, and this was December 29th of 2021, and it's China is running out of water, and that's scary for Asia. Of all Beijing's problems, demographic decline, a stifling political climate, the stalling or reversal of economic reforms, dwindling natural resources may be the most urgent. So it goes on. Nature and geopolitics can interact in nasty ways. The historian Geoffrey Parker has argued that changing weather patterns drove war, revolution, and upheaval during a long global crisis in the 17th century. More recently, climate change has opened a new trade routes, resources and rivalries in the Arctic. And now China, a great power that often appears bent on reordering the international system, is running out of water in ways that are likely to stoke conflict at home and abroad. I want to say this real quickly. They call it climate change now because they had to stop calling it global warming. See, the weather patterns around the world were changing as one place was getting hotter, other places were getting colder. So the whole global warming, that argument was destroying itself. So they moved to call it climate change, because that opens up a very broad spectrum. Everybody screams, what about climate change? What about climate change? Which part of the climate? What part of the world are you speaking of? Climates do naturally change. And I don't know, there's a little bit more to the science, but the changes to weather and climate that the world seems to be facing, I don't know. There's been a lot of changes that have been long overdue, naturally occurring. But I will say that, yes, climates do change. One example is the Sahara Desert. Every few thousand years, the Sahara Desert goes from desert to lush, tropical forest. Yes, studies have actually proven that the Sahara Desert rotates on a pattern that goes from desert to forest to desert to forest. We just happen to be in that desert time. So, back to the article, it goes on, natural resources have always been critical to economic and global power. In the 19th century, a small country, the UK, raced ahead of the pack because its abundant coal reserves allowed it to drive the Industrial Revolution. Britain was eventually surpassed by the US, which exploited its huge tracts of arable land, massive oil reserves, and other resources to become an economic titan. And this is important because the same goes for China's rise. Capitalist reforms, a welcoming global trade system, and good demographics all contributed to Beijing's world-beating economic growth from the late 1970s to the early 2000s. The fact that China was nearly self-sufficient in land, water, and many raw materials, and that its cheap labor allowed it to exploit these resources aggressively also helped it to become the workshop of the world. And this is absolutely true, and it's kind of scary. But it goes on, yet China's natural abundance is a thing of the past. As Michael Beckley and I argue in our forthcoming book, The Danger Zone, Beijing has blown through many of its resources a decade ago. China became the world's largest importer of agricultural goods a decade ago. Its arable land has been shrinking due to degradation and overuse. Breakneck development has also made China the world's largest energy importer. It buys 3/4 of its oil abroad at a time when America has become a net energy exporter. This is 2021. Yeah, that's done with. The United States is no longer a net exporter. Thanks to Biden. Wow. But China's water situation is particularly grim. As Geopolitical notes, China possesses 20% of the world's population, but only 7% of its fresh water. Entire regions, especially in the north, suffer from water scarcity, worse than that found in a parched Middle East. Thousands of rivers have disappeared whilst industrialization and pollution have spoiled much of the water that remains. By some estimates, 80 to 90% of China's groundwater and half of its river water is too dirty to drink. More than half of its groundwater and 1/4 of its river water cannot even be used for industry or farming. And due to drought, yeah. Apparently China's losing over $100 billion annually as a result of water scarcity. So they have major problems, population growing, and they don't have resources. And this is what, brings me to what I was saying earlier. So that, like Jen Psaki would say, I'm circling back to the point. What if all the flooding came from their attempt to manipulate the weather to get more water because they are running out? I mean, not we, but people on the left want to talk about how destructive the United States is to the planet, how the United States is the worst polluter and all this other nonsense, but won't say anything about that. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that China's water is undrinkable. They have destroyed their water. Their citizens, this is not going to go over very well. Over the course of the next 10 years, China's going to have some real major issues with the water. And I wonder if that, like I said, might have something to do with all the rain that caused all the flooding. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. It's just one part of it, because at the same time, you have in foreign affairs, it's the same thing. China. So one of the things they talked about was the fact that China's GDP has risen 40-fold since 1978. And that can't last at that rate. And this is what this is one of the things that's leading to China's expansion. They're doing debt loans. How do you think they've got their foot so far into the entire African continent? Oh, yes, the leftists, everybody wants to say, oh, no, we cannot go in and do anything. Colonialism is so bad. We can't go in and change the lives of those Africans. Meanwhile, they're trying to get the hell out of that continent to get to the United States to get what the West has. And the West keeps telling people there, like, no, you don't want this stuff. No. Colonialism is bad. Let them decide for themselves. And here's the thing. They have decided for themselves. Only problem is it was offered to them by China. The Chinese took over the slot that the United States had every opportunity, that every Western country had the opportunity to get involved in, but they didn't. So China did it. And China did it through loans that they knew that they know these countries can't pay back. And in return, they want resources. They want access to the resources. So China will now be replenishing its resources. By expanding into one of the largest resource-rich continents in the world, they basically set themselves up to be the world superpower. Was the option there for the rest of the world to be able to help that continent move up and at the same time boast of their own wallets? Yes. But no, what happened was people wanted to do shady deals. They wanted to just rip them off. China is still doing the same exact thing, except the difference is they're doing it with the purchase of the resources and promise. It's kind of similar to the thing that happened with Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine has a massive debt. Russia pays off said debt in exchange for land in the Ukraine. Ukraine accepts the deal. Ukraine decides to go back on the deal and wants to nationalize the land that's promised to Russia. Russia says, no, you can't do that. Pay us the money back, or you can't do that. Ukraine says no. They turn to the West. Russia's being big and mean, and they're being mean to us because we want to nationalize the land that we promised to them by allowing them to pay off the $40 billion in debt. Imagine. I wonder if the rest of the world will take up that same stance should any of the African nations decide to do what the Ukrainians did. Would they do the same if Kenya, Namibia, Ethiopia? I guarantee you, should a situation like this arise, you will not hear anything from Western nations about how we need to send $40 billion to some African nation so that they can fight the Chinese who are trying to take their land. It's not going to happen. And that's sad. That's really sad. And it's that kind of situation, and I hope that by putting in that perspective, it helps people understand why the United States should not be involved in the Ukrainian situation at all. But hey, look, that's just my opinion on that. Well, that's my opinion on the reality of that. But this whole situation with China goes even further. You've got China buying up American farms en masse. Now, they don't yet have such a large number as other countries have in the U.S., but I just think that's a really strange thing to be selling U.S. farmland to foreign nationals and representatives of other nations. I mean, this makes no sense because here's the thing. The more land that China acquires in other countries is actually a big deal. Now, a little known law that was passed by the CCP just a couple years ago made it illegal to speak negatively about Xi Jinping and the CCP anywhere in the world on Chinese property. I understand you don't operate outside of China without China's permission. You don't operate inside China without the CCP's permission, period. So keep in mind that China has passed a law that states it is illegal to speak negatively about the CCP or China, or China's leader, basically, Xi Jinping, negatively anywhere in the world. So the more land that China acquires, technically, believe it or not, they will run the argument that that is Chinese property. God forbid they want to enact that. Now, maybe it wouldn't be able to, I don't know, I don't think they'd be able to have some to get any leeway or any acceptance or even have that recognized in the United States, but I do believe that there are countries around the world that actually would recognize that. You could end up having that kind of situation happening in African nations, especially since China's building a military base. Yeah. First Chinese base. I think it's the first one out of China. Going to be on an African port. So they are expanding. And mind you, China's making many deals. And this is bad for the U.S. because as of right now, China has been eyeing, and they waited a while. They waited a while for the U.S. to move out of Afghanistan. But mind you, now it's estimated there's maybe $1 trillion worth of resources. There's a huge amount of resources in Afghanistan. And the Chinese have already been in talks for access to that. They have huge, mind you, massive deposits of iron, lead, tantalum, tungsten, copper, lithium, mercury. Yes, the lithium. Vroom vroom electric vehicle. Amethyst, beryl, emerald, lapis lazuli, ruby, tourmaline, uranium, coal, peat. Oh my. Gold and silver. A lot more gold than silver. But the U.S. walked out, and instead of making business with the Afghani people, they walked out, left it to the Taliban. The Taliban has no problem with working with China, and China has no problem working with them. China's working with Iran. China's actually making deals with most of the Middle East nations. They're literally spreading their Belt and Road Initiative. Now, it looks like it's having some issues. It might be facing a collapse. It's not going as smoothly as they thought it would be. I think the pandemic kind of put some brakes on that, some harsh brakes on that, but they have not stopped. As the U.S. continues to decrease its own productions, it is investing in productions around the world. So maybe it's just Maybe I'm looking too far into it. Maybe I'm going to the extreme, but one can easily look at this and say that this is all too coincidental. It's too on the nose to just be a coincidence, in my opinion. It's not coincidental. It can't be. If it walks and looks and quacks and jumps and flies like a duck, damn, it must be a duck. But again, China's making these huge investments in the resource-rich areas. And it's, as the White House continues to decrease production on these resources and minerals that the United States needs, especially for food production, they get stronger, the U.S. gets weaker. And it's not going to get any easier when you have an administration that is not focused on the nation at hand, on enriching its own people. I mean, again, I've mentioned a couple times, and I mentioned in the last episode, the Biden plan the spending plan that would have added $73 trillion spent over the course of the next 10 years. We're talking by 2032. And I'm sorry, I keep bringing it up, but you have to ask yourself, for people that keep approving of this administration and agreeing with what they're doing, how much of that $73 trillion do you think was really going to the people? Do you really think that's going to enrich your life? You will not see any of that. And if you keep relying on this idea that they're just going to tax the rich, again, ask yourself how much money do you really think there is? The United States is 30 trillion in debt. They want to spend over the course of the next 10 years 73 trillion in debt. Mind you, this is important. The United States doesn't even take in enough tax revenue to cover the amount of Social Security payments that it pays out each year. They already have to borrow money to make the Social Security payments because they don't take in enough taxes. I mean, we're talking about this idea, and I mentioned it last year that really by sometime around 2030 or a little bit after that, the U.S. could be facing $112 trillion worth of debt. Now, this is before the spending package had been released. Okay, so this is last year we were talking about this. And we were saying 112 trillion in debt. Well, we're already 30 trillion. So if they add that 73 trillion, that puts that 103 trillion. I mean, they're right on target. So granted, if you think about it, by the time we actually reach that 10-year mark, we could be well past $112 trillion in debt. We could be upwards of $120 trillion in debt. Especially if we have to go through another 4 year of a Democrat White House administration. 8 consecutive years of that is going to be destructive. And I say we might hit $120 to $130 trillion in debt if the nation still survives. We already saw what happened after 8 years of Obama, and it was not good. It was terrible. I know people want to pretend like it wasn't and have the same glossy eyes that they did with the Clinton administration, but both administrations were absolutely terrible. They had some good moments. I will not contest that. But overall, terrible administrations. So again, like I said, we're looking at well over $100 trillion in debt at the rate that they're spending by 2030. And again, you have to ask yourself, where are they getting the money from? They have to borrow it. How are they going to pay it back? The U.S. doesn't produce that much. And as they continue to decline the U.S. financially, increasing inflation, it's going to bankrupt this entire nation. It's going to hit people in ways in the pockets that has not been seen since well before the 70s. So let's hope that we can survive it till November, and we will see what will come. But I thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.